My nephew's back massage was one of the strangest, most exhilarating experiences of my life. But how did I end up in this situation? It began a few months ago on an ordinary Friday. The afternoon was remarkably peaceful, almost as if the world had paused for a breath. I dedicated my morning to overdue chores, cleaning, tidying closets, and battling the perpetual layer of dust that coated every surface. By the time I was finished, I felt utterly drained. Every muscle in my back ached, demanding respite. Olivia, my wife, had already left for work, her goodbye kiss and the lingering scent of her cologne a comforting memory. However, as the hours wore on, exhaustion gnawed at me. My back throbbed, my shoulders were knotted, and each movement was a painful reminder of years spent caring for others. I'd just resolved to take a short nap when a knock echoed through the house. It was Matteo, my nephew. At 20, he'd blossomed into a self-assured young man, yet retained a polite, almost charming reserve. As Olivia's sister's son, he was temporarily staying with us while planning his next life move. He was consistently considerate, offering to help with housework or errands. But today, something about him felt different, indefinable. "Hey, Uncle James," he greeted, his voice warm and familiar as he entered. "You look worn out. Can I get you anything?" I managed a weak smile, gesturing towards the chair beside the bed. "Just tired, that's all," I replied. "This house doesn't clean itself." Matteo chuckled softly, his gaze lingering on me a little too long. "You should rest," he said, his tone casual yet firm. "You've been overdoing it." His words struck a chord, though I wasn't sure why. Matteo's concern wasn't unusual, but his delivery held an unfamiliar nuance. I hesitated, then forced a tired laugh. "A back rub would be nice," I joked, though a part of me genuinely desired it. To my surprise, Matteo nodded. "Sure," he said, his voice steady and calm. "I can do that." I blinked, taken aback. "You don't have to, it's fine." He gently interrupted, already settling behind me on the bed. "I know how. Just relax." Before I could object, his hands were on my shoulders, his touch firm yet soothing. I sighed, the tension starting to unravel. It had been so long since anyone had cared for me in this way. I leaned into the sensation, relishing the relief. "You've been carrying a lot of stress," Matteo said gently, his fingers working the knots in my shoulders. "You should let yourself rest more." I nodded, eyes closed, absorbed in the rhythm of his hands. "Easier said than done," I mumbled. "There's always something that needs to be done." "Well, you've done enough for today," he replied, his voice dropping to a soothing murmur. "Let me take care of you for a change." His words sparked an unexpected warmth within me. There was a sincerity in his tone that made me feel acknowledged, understood. As his hands worked down my back, I relaxed further, the day's burden melting away. But then, something shifted. His touch altered, subtly at first, but perceptibly. His hands lingered, the pressure of his fingertips more deliberate. I opened my eyes, abruptly aware of our proximity, of his breath against my neck. "Is that better?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I nodded stiffly, my body buzzing with a strange energy. The air crackled with unspoken tension, accelerating my pulse. I tried to convince myself I was misinterpreting, overreacting to a simple act of kindness. But the deliberate slowness of his hands, the intimacy of his touch, fueled a growing unease. "You're always so strong," Matteo murmured, his voice low and smooth. "You deserve to feel taken care of." I froze, his words hanging in the air. My mind raced, grappling with the situation. His hands continued their descent, tracing the curve of my spine with a gentleness that was both calming and unnerving. My skin tingled under his touch, a confusing mix of sensations. "Matteo," I finally said, my voice trembling but firm. "That's enough." He paused, his hands momentarily still before leaning closer. "I just want you to relax," he whispered, his breath warm against my ear. "You've done so much for everyone else. Let me do this for you." His words shot through me, my body tensing reflexively. I wanted to pull away, I wanted to stand, to put space between us, but I was frozen, caught in a whirlwind of confusion and a deeper, unacknowledged feeling. "I mean it, Matteo," I said, my voice wavering. "You need to stop." For a heartbeat, I thought he would comply. His hands retreated slightly, his breath catching as if he were about to apologize. But then, he leaned closer, his lips brushing against my ear as he whispered, "You're beautiful, Uncle James. You always have been." The words jolted through me, stealing my breath. The room seemed to shrink, Matteo's whisper hanging heavy, undeniably intimate. I turned my head slightly, catching a glimpse of his face. The sight froze me. His expression was calm, too calm, but his eyes held an unfamiliar heat, an unsettling blend of admiration and something more profound, something that sent my pulse racing for all the wrong reasons. "Matteo," I began, my voice faltering. What could I possibly say? What words could unravel this precarious situation? "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," he said softly, his hands still on my shoulders. You deserve to know how much you're appreciated, how beautiful you are." The sincerity in his voice was disarming, but it couldn't erase the weight of his words, the lingering touch that tested boundaries. My body tensed beneath his hands, every nerve on high alert, yet I couldn't move. A part of me wanted to dismiss it as nothing, a clumsy choice of words, an innocent moment misconstrued, but the way his fingers trailed across my back told a different story. "Matteo," I repeated, firmer this time. "You need to stop. This isn't right." He removed his hands, but didn't move away. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his gaze locking onto mine with an intensity that tightened my chest. "Why not?" he asked quietly, his voice a strange mixture of defiance and vulnerability. "What's so wrong about wanting to make you feel good? You've spent your whole life taking care of everyone else. Don't you deserve this?" His words stung, both for their audacity and the truth they contained. I had spent years prioritizing others, sacrificing my own happiness for family, appearances, obligation. But that didn't justify this, didn't make what he was saying or doing acceptable. "This isn't about me," I said, my voice shaking. "It's about boundaries, respect. And this crosses a line." For a moment, Matteo looked as though he might argue, his lips parting in protest. But then, he closed his mouth, his jaw tightening as he nodded slowly. "I'm sorry," he said, though his tone didn't convey genuine remorse. "I didn't mean to upset you." The tension remained, but I seized the chance to create distance. "It's fine," I said quickly, standing and moving towards the door. Let's not talk about this again, okay?" "Okay," he replied softly, his voice unreadable. "If that's what you want." I paused at the doorway, my hand on the handle, glancing back at him. He was still on the bed, posture relaxed, but his eyes remained fixed on mine. There was something unsettling in his expression, a quiet confidence as though he hadn't heard a word I'd said. I left without another word, my thoughts a chaotic mess. We both knew it wasn't over. And we were right. Something was still coming, something neither of us could have foreseen, something that would surprise and excite me in ways I couldn't imagine, spiraling into an unexpected experience. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I occupied myself with mundane tasks, laundry, mail, wiping down counters, but nothing could dispel the anxiety gnawing at me. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt Matteo's hands on my shoulders, heard the soft whisper in my ear. The memory made my skin crawl, but also left a persistent unease. When Olivia returned, I feigned normalcy, forcing a smile and asking about her day as if nothing had happened. But the guilt gnawed at me, a constant reminder of the boundary I hadn't enforced quickly enough. Matteo kept his distance, offering polite nods and casual conversation that only amplified my unease. It was as though he was playing a part, wearing a mask only I could see through. That night, lying beside Olivia, my mind raced. Should I tell her? Confront Matteo again? Or bury the memory and hope it never resurfaced? The weight of the decision was suffocating. I tossed and turned restlessly, even as exhaustion pulled at me. The next morning, I awoke early, stiff and tired. I stumbled into the kitchen, hoping coffee would clear the fog in my mind. The house was quiet, only the hum of the refrigerator breaking the silence as I went through the familiar routine of coffee and toast. Then Matteo entered, and the stillness shattered. "Morning, Uncle James," he said. His tone was light and casual as he poured himself a glass of orange juice. "Sleep well?" I froze, my hand hovering over the toaster, forcing myself to answer. "Fine," I said curtly, the tightness in my voice betraying me. He leaned against the counter, his gaze steady as he studied me. "You seem tense," he observed, his voice smooth but tinged with something darker. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," I replied, my tone clipped, avoiding his eyes. "Just a lot on your mind?" He let the sentence hang in the air, his smile soft but knowing. "Well, if you ever need to talk." He left the words unspoken, but the implication sent a chill down my spine. I busied myself with buttering my toast, desperate to avoid his gaze. But his presence loomed behind me, too close, too deliberate. I could feel his eyes on me, and it made my skin crawl. "I appreciate that," I said, forcing a polite smile as I turned to face him. "But I'm fine, really." He nodded, his expression unreadable as he sipped his juice. "If you say so," he said lightly. But there was an edge to his tone that made my stomach churn. I turned back to the counter, my hands trembling slightly as I tried to focus on the mundane task of eating breakfast. But deep down I knew things wouldn't go back to normal. Not after what had happened. Not after the line that had been crossed. The coffee mug in my hands felt too hot, but I didn't move to set it down. Instead, I stood at the kitchen counter, staring out the window, letting the rising steam blur my view of the garden. Behind me, I could hear Matteo moving around the room, his footsteps slow and deliberate, his presence impossible to ignore. Every muscle in my body tensed, as if bracing for something, though I didn't know what. "I've been thinking," Matteo said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. It was calm, almost too calm, like he'd been rehearsing the words in his head. "About yesterday." My heart skipped a beat, but I didn't turn around. I kept my gaze fixed on the window, the garden blurring further as my breath fogged the glass. "There's nothing to think about," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "It was a misunderstanding." "Was it?" he asked, the question hanging in the air like a challenge. I turned then, slowly, gripping the mug tightly as though it were the only thing keeping me grounded. Matteo stood a few feet away, his posture relaxed, but his eyes intense. There was something unnerving about the way he looked at me, unwavering, as though he could see through every layer of my defenses. "Yes," I said firmly, meeting his gaze even though it made my stomach churn. "It was." Matteo tilted his head slightly, his expression thoughtful. "I don't think it was," he said softly. "I think you felt it too." The words sent a jolt through me, and I tightened my grip on the mug until I was afraid it might shatter. "This isn't appropriate," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. "You need to stop." "Why?" he asked, taking a step closer. His tone wasn't aggressive, but there was a quiet persistence in it that made my pulse race. "Because it scares you? Because it makes you feel something you don't want to admit?" "Matteo!" I snapped, setting the mug down on the counter with a clatter. "You're crossing a line." He stopped, his expression softening, but his gaze remaining steady. "I don't want to upset you," he said quietly. "But I can't pretend I don't see what's happening here." "There's nothing happening," I said quickly, my words rushed and defensive. "You're imagining things." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us felt thick, almost suffocating, and I struggled to steady my breathing. Matteo's gaze didn't waver, but he didn't move closer either. Instead, he leaned back against the counter, his posture casual despite the tension radiating from him. "You deserve to be happy," he said finally, his voice softer now. "You deserve to feel seen." The words hit harder than I wanted to admit, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. I turned back toward the window, blinking rapidly as I tried to compose myself. The garden outside seemed impossibly distant, the vibrant colors muted by the fog of my own thoughts. "You don't understand," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. This isn't about me." "Isn't it?" he asked, his tone gentle but insistent. When was the last time you did something just for yourself, Uncle James? When was the last time someone made you feel special? His words struck a nerve, and I felt my resolve begin to crumble. It wasn't fair the way he seemed to know exactly where to push, exactly which insecurities to exploit. I hated how much truth there was in his questions, how deeply they cut into the loneliness I had been trying so hard to ignore. I'm fine, I said finally, though the words felt hollow. I don't need anyone to take care of me. I think you do, Matteo said simply, his voice steady and calm. And I think you're too afraid to admit it. I turned to face him again, my chest tightening as his words sank in. There was no malice in his expression, no smugness or arrogance, just a quiet determination that made it impossible to dismiss him outright. This conversation is over, I said firmly, though my voice wavered. I need you to leave, Matteo. I hesitated, my gaze searching his. Then I nodded slowly, pushing myself away from the counter. If that's what you want, I said softly. But I'm not going anywhere, Uncle James. You can't just pretend this doesn't exist. As he left the kitchen, the sound of his footsteps fading into the distance, I let out a shaky breath, leaning heavily against the counter. My hands trembled as I picked up the coffee mug, but the drink had gone cold. I set it down again, my thoughts racing as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Later that evening, as I sat alone in the living room, the sound of footsteps behind me made my heart jump. I turned to see Matteo standing in the doorway, his expression calm but unreadable. He didn't say anything, but the intensity in his gaze spoke volumes. Is something wrong? I asked, my voice careful. I wanted to check on you, he said simply, stepping into the room. You've seemed off today. I'm fine, I replied quickly, my tone defensive. Just tired. Matteo didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked over to the couch, sitting down beside me with a casual ease that felt too deliberate. I shifted uncomfortably, my pulse quickening as his presence filled the space around me. You don't have to keep pushing me away, he said softly, his voice low. I'm not the enemy here. Then stop acting like one, I shot back, my frustration breaking through. You're making this harder than it needs to be. I'm not trying to make it hard, he said, his tone calm but firm. I'm trying to make you see that it doesn't have to be this way. You don't have to carry everything on your own. I opened my mouth to argue, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I stood up, putting as much distance between us as I could. I need some air, I said shortly, heading toward the door without looking back. The night air was cool against my skin as I stepped onto the back porch. The sky was dark, scattered with faint stars, and the distant hum of crickets filled the silence. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to shake off the tension that had built up over the day. The conversation with Matteo had left me rattled, his words looping endlessly in my mind. You deserve to feel seen. I leaned against the railing, staring out into the shadowy expanse of the yard. It was infuriating how his voice seemed to echo in my thoughts, how he'd managed to touch on feelings I had worked so hard to suppress. Loneliness wasn't a stranger to me. It was an old companion I'd learned to live with. But the way Matteo spoke, the way he looked at me, threatened to drag those feelings to the surface, forcing me to confront things I wasn't ready to face. Uncle James. The sound of his voice startled me, and I turned quickly to see Matteo standing in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, his hands tucked casually into his pockets, but there was a tension in his posture that told me he wasn't just here to chat. I needed some air, I said quickly, my voice sharper than I intended. You should go back inside. He didn't move. Instead, he stepped out onto the porch, letting the door swing shut behind him. The sound made me flinch, and I took a small step back, my hands gripping the railing tightly. You've been avoiding me all day, he said quietly, his gaze steady. We need to talk. There's nothing to talk about, I replied, though my voice wavered. What happened yesterday? It was a mistake. It didn't feel like a mistake, he said, his tone calm but firm. Not to me. The words sent a jolt through me, and I shook my head quickly, trying to dispel the weight of them. You don't understand, I said, my voice trembling. This can't happen. It shouldn't have happened. Why not? He asked, stepping closer. Because it scares you? Because it makes you feel something you don't want to admit? Stop, I said sharply, holding up a hand as if to ward him off. This isn't up for discussion, Matteo. You're crossing a line. I'm not the only one crossing it, he said, his voice low and insistent. "You can tell yourself whatever you want, but I see the way you look at me. I know you feel it too." The accusation made my chest tighten, and I felt a flush creep up my neck. "You don't know anything," I snapped, though the words felt hollow. "You're imagining things." "Am I?" he asked, his gaze piercing. "Because it doesn't feel that way to me." The tension between us was suffocating, the air around us thick with unspoken words. Matteo took another step closer, his presence overwhelming, and I found myself frozen in place, unable to move or speak. His eyes searched mine, his expression a mix of determination and something else, something softer, almost pleading. "I just want to understand," he said quietly. "Why are you so afraid to let yourself feel this, to let yourself be happy?" "Because it's wrong," I said, my voice breaking. "Don't you get that? This, whatever this is, it's wrong." Matteo didn't flinch at my words. Instead, he reached out, his hand brushing lightly against mine. The touch was soft, hesitant, but it sent a shock through me, my breath hitching in my throat. "It doesn't feel wrong to me," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "It feels real." The sincerity in his voice was disarming, and for a moment, I felt my resolve waver. I wanted to argue, to push him away, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, as his hand lingered on mine, his gaze holding me captive. "Matteo," I whispered, my voice trembling. "This isn't... We can't..." "We already have," he said, his tone steady, and I couldn't pretend it hadn't resonated. I yearned to shout, to tell him he was mistaken, but the reality was, I couldn't. He wasn't wrong. The bond between us, the magnetic pull, the way life felt vibrant whenever he was close, it was undeniable, no matter how desperately I wished to refute it. "Please," I finally managed, my voice barely a whisper. "Just go inside. Please." For a moment, I feared he might protest. His jaw clenched, his eyes searched mine, as if seeking a flicker of hesitation, a chink in my armor. But then he nodded slowly, retreating and releasing my hand. "I'll go," he conceded quietly, "but this isn't over." A shiver ran down my spine at his words, and I watched silently as he turned and walked back into the house, the door clicking shut behind him. I lingered there for a long time, gripping the railing, trying to control my breathing. The night air felt oppressive, a weight I couldn't escape. When I finally re-entered, the house was dark and silent. I navigated the shadows, avoiding Matteo's room as I ascended the stairs. My bedroom door seemed like a shield, a small but vital boundary between me and the turmoil that always seemed to accompany him. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, his words reverberated in my mind, refusing to be silenced. "This isn't over." And damn, he was right. It wasn't. Because the next morning, I awoke to the pale light of dawn filtering through the curtains. Sleep had been fitful, fractured by restless dreams, and the echo of Matteo's declaration. My body felt heavy as I sat up, the weight of everything pressing down on my chest. I craved clarity, space to think, but the house felt suffocating. Every corner seemed imbued with his presence, his voice, his touch. Determined to find some distraction, I donned a light sweater and went downstairs. The familiar aroma of brewing coffee drifted through the air, but the sight of Matteo at the kitchen table halted me in my tracks. He sat with a mug in his hands, his gaze fixed on the window, lost in thought. When he noticed me, his expression softened into something I couldn't decipher. "Morning," he said, his tone casual, yet I sensed the underlying tension. "Morning," I replied curtly, moving toward the counter, avoiding his eyes. My hands trembled as I poured myself a cup, and I inwardly cursed this visible sign of my unease. "You didn't sleep well," he observed, more a statement than a question. "I slept fine," I lied, keeping my back to him as I stirred my coffee. "You don't have to lie to me," he said softly, his voice steady. "I can tell when something's bothering you." His words made me grip the edge of the counter, my knuckles white. "Matteo," I said, turning to face him, forcing as much composure as I could muster. "We need to move past this. Whatever you think is happening here, it isn't." He tilted his head, his expression calm but challenging. "You can say that all you want, Uncle James, but it doesn't change how I feel, or how you feel. You know what? Let me massage you." My stomach churned, and I set down my mug with a clatter, unable to suppress the mounting frustration. "You don't know how I feel," I snapped, my voice sharper than I intended. "And you don't get to tell me what I'm thinking." Matteo stood, the chair scraping against the floor as he pushed it back. "I don't have to tell you," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "It's written all over your face." The words hung heavy and undeniable between us. I opened my mouth to argue, but nothing came out. His gaze was unwavering, making me feel exposed in a way that was both infuriating and disarming. "This isn't fair," I finally managed, my voice trembling. "You're twisting everything, making it seem like what?" he interrupted, stepping closer. "Like you're human? Like you deserve to be noticed, appreciated?" I recoiled slightly, the intensity of his words striking a raw nerve. "You don't understand," I stammered, my voice wavering. "This isn't about me." "It is," he said firmly. "You just don't want to admit it." The ensuing silence was suffocating, the weight of his gaze pinning me in place. My chest tightened as I searched for an escape, a way to diffuse the situation without acknowledging the truth in his words. "I can't do this," I whispered, my hands trembling. "I can't have this conversation." Matteo's expression softened, but the intensity in his eyes remained. "You don't have to," he said quietly, "but you can't keep running from it." He stepped back, his posture relaxing as he moved toward the door. "I'm going for a walk," he said over his shoulder. "You should think about what you really want." I stood frozen as he left, the sound of the closing door echoing in the quiet house. My thoughts swirled, each one more chaotic than the last. What did I want? The question was as terrifying as it was unavoidable. Hours crawled by, but I couldn't shake the lingering tension. I busied myself with chores, hoping the repetitive motions would provide a distraction, but my mind kept returning to Matteo's words. "You deserve to be noticed." The truth of it gnawed at me, pulling at every thread of doubt and insecurity I'd tried to bury. When the door finally opened again, I flinched, my heart racing as Matteo stepped inside. His hair was damp from the cool air, and his cheeks were flushed, but his expression was composed. He didn't speak right away, simply removing his jacket and hanging it by the door. "Did you think about what I said?" he asked, his tone soft yet resolute. "I don't want to talk about it." "Okay, you can massage me." "All right then, lie down," he said, and so I did. I removed my shirt so he could properly massage me, and he positioned himself accordingly. "You can't pretend there's no tension between us, Uncle," he stated. His words resonated with an uncomfortable truth I'd been avoiding, and I felt tears prick my eyes. "This isn't right," I murmured, my voice barely a whisper. "It can't be." "Why not?" he asked softly, his tone gentle yet persistent. "Because someone told you it wasn't? Because you've spent your whole life prioritizing others?" The lump in my throat prevented a response, and I turned away, gripping the edge of the counter for support. Matteo moved closer, his presence overwhelming, yet I couldn't bring myself to stop him. "You don't have to fight this," he whispered, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. "You don't have to fight me." The warmth of his touch sent a shiver through me, and my resolve began to crumble. My mind screamed at me to push him away, to end this before it spiraled further out of control, but my body betrayed me. I remained motionless. "Please," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was pleading with him or myself. Matteo stepped around me, his hand brushing against mine as he turned me to face him. His gaze was steady, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could do nothing but stand there as the space between us vanished. His hands began to explore forbidden territory, breaching boundaries that left us both speechless in the deafening stillness. I was frozen, chest heaving, trying to process the tumultuous emotions swirling within me. Matteo's hand rested lightly on mine, anchoring me to the moment, his gaze unwavering. The walls I'd so carefully constructed around myself began to crumble. "You don't have to keep pretending," he said finally, his voice low and coaxing. "You don't have to carry everything on your own." His words, spoken with such conviction, felt both like a lifeline and a trap. "Matteo," I breathed, my voice trembling, "you don't understand." "I do," he insisted, his tone firm but gentle. "More than you think. I know how lonely you've been. I see it every day, and I want to help." "Help?" I echoed, a bitter laugh escaping before I could stop it. "This isn't help. This is—" I trailed off, unable to articulate the whirlwind of confusion, guilt, and something darker, something I didn't want to name. Matteo's grip on my hand tightened slightly, grounding me even as it sent my pulse racing. "This is real," he said quietly, his gaze searching mine. "And you know it." I wanted to deny it, to push him away and establish an uncrossable line. But the certainty in his eyes made it impossible. I felt exposed, vulnerable in a way I hadn't been in years. Despite every instinct screaming at me to run, I didn't. Instead, I remained there, letting his words penetrate the fragile barriers I'd clung to. And so I kissed him. As we kissed, his hands continued their exploration. It felt amazing, yet incredibly wrong. My own nephew. But after a moment I spoke. "It doesn't matter if it's real," I said, my voice barely audible. "It's wrong." "Why?" he asked, his tone soft but persistent. "Because someone told you it should be? Because you're afraid of what people will think?" "Yes," I admitted, the word escaping before I could stop it. "Yes, I'm afraid. And you should be too. This isn't just about me, Matteo. This is about what's right." His expression faltered for the first time, a flicker of doubt crossing his face, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the same quiet determination. "I don't care what anyone else thinks," he stated simply. "I care about you." The sincerity in his voice sent a shiver through me, and my resolve wavered. For a moment, the room blurred, the edges of reality softening as I stood on the precipice of something irreversible. Matteo's hand moved to my cheek, his touch gentle, and I closed my eyes, overwhelmed by his presence. "I can't do this," I whispered, though the words felt hollow. "You can," he said, his voice steady. "You just have to let yourself." I opened my eyes, meeting his gaze one last time. The intensity there almost made me falter. But then a sharp knock at the front door shattered the silence, breaking the spell between us. My heart leaped into my throat as I pulled away quickly, my hands trembling. Matteo stepped back, his expression unreadable, glancing toward the door. "You should get that," he said, his voice calm but distant. I nodded, speechless, and moved toward the door, my legs feeling weak. When I opened it, Olivia stood there, her face lighting up with a smile. "Hey," she said cheerfully, stepping inside. "Thought I'd surprise you and come home early." My stomach churned as I forced a smile, the weight of everything threatening to crush me. "That's nice," I managed weakly, stepping aside to let her in. As Olivia entered, her presence filled the space with a comfortable ease that now felt alien. I glanced back at the kitchen. Matteo stood there, his posture relaxed, but his gaze intense as he observed us. He remained silent, but the look in his eyes spoke volumes. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of polite conversation and forced smiles. I felt like I was moving through a dream, detached from reality. Every time Matteo entered the room, my heart raced, the tension between us palpable even in the most mundane moments. Olivia seemed oblivious, her attention focused on recounting her workday and catching up on news. When the house finally fell quiet that night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment in my mind. The weight of what had almost happened, of what might still happen, pressed heavily on my chest, suffocating me. I knew I had to make a choice, to draw a line that couldn't be crossed again. But the truth was, I wasn't sure I could. I need help processing this. Please share your thoughts.